I had just transitioned out of my previous apartment and was caught in that awkward, uncomfortable limbo where you have a move-out date but no clear move-in date for the next place. It was a stressful period, filled with the constant checking of real estate apps and the tedious task of moving my entire life into a cold, metallic storage unit. Because I needed a place to stay for several weeks while I hunted for a new home, I turned to a popular vacation rental site and found a small house in a quiet neighborhood. It was located about 30 minutes away from my old neighborhood, situated in a town that felt almost frozen in time. It wasn't the kind of place that would ever be featured in a travel magazine. It wasn't particularly clean or modern, but it wasn't a total wreck either. It was just a place to exist for a while. The first few days were mostly uneventful, marked by the quiet monotony of a neighborhood where very little seemed to happen. However, the atmosphere shifted on one of my first nights there. I was standing near the front window, perhaps just checking the weather or glancing at the streetlights, when I noticed two men standing on the sidewalk directly in front of the house. They weren't just passing through. They were stationary, their bodies angled toward the house, their eyes clearly fixed on the building where I was staying. The moment our eyes met through the glass, their posture changed instantly. They looked away with a practiced quickness and hurried out of the area. It was an odd interaction, one that left a lingering sense of discomfort, but I tried to rationalize it. I figured they might just be locals curious about a new face in a small town. I pulled the blinds shut, trying to physically block out the unease, and went about my evening. The following morning and early afternoon passed without incident, but the strange feeling returned when I stepped outside to my car to grab a few things I had forgotten. As I reached for the door handle, I noticed a man standing by the curb just one house over. When I looked up, we made direct eye contact. He didn't look away like the men from the previous night. Instead, he maintained a heavy, unsettling stare that felt far too personal. It was the kind of look you give someone you recognize or someone you have a specific grievance with. I felt a cold chill despite the afternoon sun, and I quickly retreated back inside the house. I wondered if he could have been one of the men from the night before, but it had been too dark to catch any distinct features then. I tried to tell myself I was being paranoid, that perhaps he was just an eccentric neighbor, and I forced myself to focus on my work. I spent the next several hours buried in my laptop, alternating between my job and the endless scroll of apartment listings. By the time I looked up, it was 8:00 p.m. I headed downstairs to the kitchen to throw together a quick dinner, and by 9:00 p.m. I was preparing for bed. I tied up a bag of trash and walked it out to the bins located on the side of the house. While I was out there in the cool night air, I noticed a small stone path I hadn't seen before. It was partially overgrown, leading toward the backyard. I realized then that I had been so preoccupied with my housing crisis that I hadn't even looked at the backyard since I arrived. Curiosity got the better of me, and I followed the path through an old, weathered wooden gate. From the windows inside the house, the backyard had looked small and empty, containing nothing but a simple fire pit. However, once I was actually in the yard, I saw a large shed tucked off to the side, built from the same graying wood as the fence. My heart skipped a beat when I saw a faint glow emanating from the gaps in the wooden planks. Someone had left a light on. I approached the structure cautiously, listening for any sound of movement or voices, but the air remained silent. I pulled the door open, expecting to find a stash of rusty garden tools or boxes of junk. Instead, the interior was bizarrely domestic. The shed was mostly empty except for an old couch, a couple of desks, and a few dressers. It looked less like a storage space and more like a makeshift living area. The sight of the furniture and the glowing overhead bulb sent a wave of genuine concern through me. It looked as though someone had been spending time in there recently. I clicked off the light and hurried back to the main house, my mind racing. I tried to convince myself that the host had probably just left the light on weeks ago and that the furniture was simply being stored there. But that little voice in the back of my head was screaming that something was wrong. To calm my nerves, I sat on the living room couch and turned on the television. The couch was a comfortable pull-out recliner, and within 30 minutes, the exhaustion of the move and the stress of the day caught up to me. I fell into a deep, heavy sleep right there in the living room, unaware that the real nightmare was only just beginning. I don't know how long I was out, but I was jolted awake by a distinct, heavy thump coming from somewhere within the house. My eyes snapped open, and the silence of the room felt thick and suffocating. Then I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Someone was inside the house with me. I listened, paralyzed, as the footsteps moved slowly and deliberately down the staircase. They crossed into the front hallway and headed toward one of the back rooms. For a second, I thought I was dreaming, trapped in a sleep paralysis hallucination, but the vibration of the floorboards was too real. I slid off the couch and crept toward the corner of the room, peeking around the wall into the darkened hallway. A dark figure was standing there, his back turned to me. He was peering into the rooms as if searching for something or someone. I pulled back into the shadows, my heart hammering against my ribs so loudly I was sure he could hear it. I heard the footsteps approaching the living room. I moved to the darkest corner of the room, pressing my back against the wall. The man walked into the doorway and stopped. He was a silhouette against the dim light from the hallway, his face obscured by the shadows. He stood perfectly still, looking toward the couch where I had been sleeping just moments before. He mumbled something under his breath, a short, frustrated whisper. "Where the hell?" He sounded annoyed, like a hunter who had lost sight of his prey. He didn't see me crouching in the pitch-black corner, and after a few more seconds of searching the empty room with his eyes, he turned and exited through the back door. I didn't wait to see if he was coming back. I grabbed my keys and phone and ran for my life. After the dark figure disappeared through the back door and the heavy silence of the house returned, I didn't waste a single second. My body was operating on pure adrenaline, a primal instinct for survival that completely overrode the confusion and terror I had felt just moments before. I grabbed my phone and my car keys, my fingers fumbling in the darkness, and bolted out of the house toward my vehicle. Every shadow on the lawn seemed to reach for me, and every rustle of the wind felt like a hand on my shoulder. Once I was inside the car with the doors locked, I threw it into gear and sped away from that neighborhood as fast as I could, not stopping until I was several blocks away in a well-lit area. Once I felt I was at a safe distance, I dialed 911. My voice was trembling so violently that I had to repeat my location and the nature of the emergency several times to the operator. I explained that an intruder had been inside my rental, that he had been searching for me, and that I was currently in my car fleeing the scene. While waiting for the police to arrive, I also attempted to contact the Airbnb host. I called multiple times, hopping for an explanation or at least a sign that he was aware of what was happening, but my calls went completely unanswered. The silence from the host was a heavy weight in my chest, adding a layer of suspicion to an already horrifying situation. The police arrived at the house relatively quickly, and to my absolute shock, the host showed up just minutes after the officers did, despite having ignored my urgent phone calls only moments prior. The scene was surreal. Flashing blue and red lights reflected off the weathered wood of the house while the host stood there looking remarkably calm, almost as if he had been expecting the commotion. The officers went through the home with high-powered flashlights, checking every room, the hallway, and the staircase where I had first heard the intruder. They took a detailed report of everything I had seen and heard, including the man's frustrated whisper and his focus on the couch where I had been sleeping. However, the police investigation yielded very little. After an hour of searching, they found no one on the property and no signs of forced entry. To them, it was a terrifying report with no physical evidence to back it up. They finished their notes, gave me a case number, and eventually left. I managed to secure a refund for the remainder of my stay and left the town that very night, driving until the sun began to peek over the horizon. But as the adrenaline faded and the cold reality of the night set in, the pieces of the puzzle started to click together in a way that made my blood run cold. I became, and still am, utterly convinced that the man I saw in the house was the owner himself. Everything about the encounter points to someone who had intimate knowledge of the property and a specific reason for being there. The most disturbing realization was the sequence of his movements within the house. When I first woke up, I heard his footsteps coming from the upstairs area. This meant that the moment he entered the home, he didn't go for the electronics in the living room or the food in the kitchen. He walked directly to the bedroom. He went straight to where a guest would normally be sleeping at that hour. It was only after he found the bedroom empty that he retreated back down the stairs to search the rest of the house. He was methodically checking every potential sleeping spot in the building. When he finally reached the living room and saw the empty recliner, his whispered, "Where the hell?" wasn't about a missing object, it was about me. He knew I was supposed to be inside, and he was frustrated that I wasn't in the bed where I belonged. He had entered the home with a specific target in mind, and that target was the person he believed was sleeping upstairs. If I hadn't accidentally fallen asleep on the couch while watching TV, I would have been in that upstairs bedroom when he walked in. I don't know if I would have woken up in time to hide, or what his intentions were once he found me, but the calculated nature of his search suggested something far more sinister than a simple check-in or a burglary. Looking back at the shed in the backyard with the couch, the desks, and the lights left on, I realized the entire property was set up for someone to be watching and waiting. The shed wasn't for storage, it was a vantage point. I truly believe that if I hadn't been out of place that night, I might have gone missing and never been seen again. The realization that I was being hunted in my own temporary home is a shadow that follows me every time I travel now. I never book a rental without meticulously checking the locks, scanning for hidden entry points, and investigating the layout of the property. That night taught me that the person you're paying for a place to stay might be the very person you need to stay away from. The quiet town I thought I was staying in was just a backdrop for a much darker story that I narrowly escaped. The weight of that experience changed my perspective on safety forever. In the days following the incident, I found myself looking over my shoulder even in crowded places. I couldn't stop thinking about those two men I had seen on the sidewalk the first night. Were they accomplices? Were they part of a larger plan to monitor who was coming and going from that specific house? It felt as though I had accidentally stepped into a trap that had been carefully laid long before I arrived. The fact that the host appeared so quickly after the police were called, but refused to answer his phone, suggested he was nearby the entire time, perhaps watching the house from that very shed in the backyard. I spent weeks searching for any similar stories online about that specific rental or that host, but I found nothing. It was as if the house and its secrets were designed to remain invisible. The feeling of being watched, the "where the hell" whisper, and the methodical search of the bedrooms remain etched in my memory like a scar. Even now, years later, when I walk into a hotel or a rental, I don't see a place to relax. I see a series of entry points that need to be secured. I check the closets, I check the space under the beds, and I always look for a secondary exit. That house in the quiet town took away my sense of security, and in its place, it left a permanent, restless vigilance. I hope that by sharing this, others realize that quiet and safe are not always the same thing, and sometimes the person holding the keys is the one you should fear most.